Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Today we are taking an updated look at the gaming performance of AMD's Ryzen 7 7800X 3D, and then we're comparing that with Intel's best, the 13900K. Well, the best would probably be the 1300KS, but I'm just going to assume that you're not into wasting money on dumb products, so we'll be going with the much more sensible 13900K. But before we do, today's sponsor spot is brought to you by Hetzner. With hundreds of thousands of servers spread across several locations, Hetzner is one of the biggest European web hosts and data center operators. With their strong focus on sustainability, they offer high-performance dedicated servers in their server auction. There you can find different kinds of servers, even configured ones, at incredibly low prices without a setup fee or any minimum contract period. So you can save money while acting very sustainable. Hetzner offers a vast range of server products at fantastic prices, so for more information, please check the link in the video description. Okay, so recently I took a look at gaming performance of the Core i7 13700K and compared it to the 7800X 3D. The Ryzen 7 processor was faster overall, offering 11% more performance on average at 1080p, but once we factored in the price of the DDR5 7200 memory, which was required to extract that level of performance from the i7, we found that pricing between both of these options was much of a muchness, making it very difficult to recommend the Intel processor purely for gaming. Of course, there is an even faster option from Intel, and that's what we'll be looking at today. Now, for gaming, the key advantage the Core i9 has over the i7 is a 20% increase in L3 cache to 36 megabytes, and a small frequency bump of around 2 to 5% depending on which frequency you're looking at. There are other advantages as well, such as a doubling of E-cores from 8 to 16, but that's not particularly useful for those of you just focused on gaming. All said and done though, the 13900K does cost a little over 40% more than the 13700K, so that's going to hurt it in terms of value versus the Ryzen 7 7800X 3D. Anyway, enough chit chat, let's just get on with it. For testing, the 7800X 3D was installed on the Gigabyte X670E Aorus Master using the latest F11C BIOS revision and DDR5 6000 CL30 memory. Meanwhile, the 13700K was benchmarked using the MSI MPG Z790 Carbon Wi-Fi with DDR5 7200 memory, as the Intel CPU does support higher clocked memory. So we're giving it every chance possible when comparing out-of-the-box configurations. Then for the graphics card, we're of course using the Asus ROG Strix RTX 4090 OC Edition, which has been benchmarked at 1080p, 1440p, and even 4K, so let's get into it. First up, we have Hogwarts Legacy using the ultra quality settings, and previously I found the 7800X 3D was just 8% faster than the 13700K at 1080p. The 13900K, that does a good job of closing the gap, as now the Ryzen processor is just 3% faster, so a negligible performance difference there. Similar margins are also seen at 1440p before the results became entirely GPU limited at 4K. Now with ray tracing enabled, we do find much of the same, so similar performance between all three CPUs, though the 1% lows of the 7800X 3D do improve dramatically here. At 1080p, we see that the average frame rate for the Ryzen 7 part is just 5% greater than that of the 13900K, but the 1% lows, they're improved by 13%, so that is a noticeable difference. Now moving on to Spider-Man Remastered, we find the 7800X 3D and 13900K are neck and neck. The 13900K is a little bit faster when comparing the average frame rate, while the 1% lows are a bit better for the 7800X 3D. Then with ray tracing enabled, the 13900K and 7800X 3D once again find themselves neck and neck. There's just a few percent in it here, so no real winner in my opinion, as performance is really close enough to call a tie. As we found in the past, for pushing 300 FPS in Fortnite, any modern high-end CPU, it's going to get the job done, and when using the epic quality settings, you'll be able to max out an RTX 4090 with any one of these three CPUs. And it's much the same story with ray tracing enabled, though we did manage to extract a few extra frames with the 13900K, but we're only talking about a mere 3% boost over the 7800X 3D at 1080p, and then of course we're entirely GPU limited at 1440p and 4K. Moving on to The Last of Us Part 1, we again find basically identical performance between the 7800X 3D and 13900K. The 7800X 3D was up to 10% faster than the 13700K at 1080p, but the Core i9 processor was able to close that gap entirely. Now, the 7800X 3D is very fast in Star Wars Jedi Survivor, and the 13900K was unable to catch it, only boosting performance over the Core i7 part by a mere 5%, making the Ryzen 7 processor 15% faster at 1080p. That said though, we do end up entirely GPU limited at the 1440p resolution with 160 FPS on average. Next up, we have Halo Infinite, and like Fortnite, this is another game that's largely GPU limited, though at 1080p we do appear to be hitting a game limit as performance isn't greatly reduced when increasing the resolution to 1440p. Whatever the case though, both the 13900K and 7800X3D are able to get the most out of the RTX 4090. Another game where these latest generation CPUs are able to maximize the performance of the RTX 4090 is Warhammer 3, and as a result, even the 1080p data is GPU limited, so there's not much more to report here. Let's just move along. Now, we see that the 13900K is not really offering much in the way of extra performance over the 13700K in F122, just a few extra frames at 1080p. That meant that the 7800X3D was 7% faster, which certainly not a massive margin, and by the time we hit 1440p, the game was entirely GPU limited. Moving on to Cyberpunk 2077, which is quite a CPU demanding game, we find the 13900K is able to nudge ahead of the 7800X3D at 1080p, though only by a 4% margin, and the 1% lows were much the same. Still, the 13900K did offer a good boost over the 13700K, which allowed it to match/beat the Ryzen 7 processor. Now, although Cyberpunk 2077 is a CPU-demanding game, with ray tracing enabled, any of these CPUs are more than powerful enough to extract the maximum amount of performance from the RTX 4090, even at 1080p, where the 13900K and 7800X3D allowed for an average of 123 FPS. The 13900K managed to pull out an 8% win over the 7800X3D in the Callisto Protocol at 1080p, pushing 283 FPS, whereas the Ryzen part could only match the Core i7. That said, at 1440p they were again neck and neck, and of course, the same was also true for the heavily GPU-limited 4K resolution. Now, Hitman 3 provides us with some similar-looking sets of results to that of the Callisto Protocol. The 13900K was again the fastest CPU, this time delivering 6% more frames at 1080p before becoming GPU-limited at 1440p. The 7800X3D though still appears to have the edge in Far Cry 6, hitting 237 FPS on average, making it 10% faster than the 13900K. Scaling this one though is a bit odd. We've seemed to run into some kind of system or game limitation at just over 200 FPS. Clearly Far Cry 6 isn't a game that's meant to be played at hundreds of frames per second, and I can't imagine it was designed with that kind of throughput in mind. Shadow of the Tomb Raider is another CPU-heavy game, especially in the village section that we use for testing, so we're not using the built-in benchmark here. That said, as we've found a number of times now, the 13900K and 7800X3D are powerful enough to get the most out of the RTX 4090 in this title, even at 1080p, so overall performance is again much the same. Next up we have Rainbow Six Siege, and a few notes on the testing here. I've noticed that the 3D Vcache CPUs produce really high scores for the first few benchmark passes. It takes around 6 back-to-back loops of the benchmark before the numbers level off. I assume that this is something to do with filling the 3D Vcache, as it's not something I witnessed with the Intel CPUs, and at the second run generally leveled off the 13900K. I've also moved from the Vulkan API to DirectX 11, as both the 7800X3D and 13900K were faster using DX11 with the RTX 4090. So whereas previously the 7800X3D had a reasonable performance advantage over the 1300K in this test, they're now much the same, though the 1% lows were still higher for the Ryzen processor at 1080p. Horizon Zero Dawn does favour the 7800X3D, and the results are very consistent, handing AMD a 10% win at 1080p and 9% at 1440p. Interestingly, the 13900K is not much faster than the 13700K, so it's difficult to say what exactly the limitation is here for Intel's Raptor Lake CPUs. Moving on, we know that ACC loves AMD's 3D Vcache, but again, I find it interesting that the extra L3 of the i9 is not really helping relative to the i7. Just a 4% boost is seen at 1080p. Meanwhile, the 7800X3D is 27% faster than the 1300K, averaging an impressive 218 FPS, so a big win here for the Ryzen processor. Resident Evil 4 is a relatively new addition to our CPU benchmarks, and it has some interesting results for us. The 13900K is a good bit faster than the 13700K, boosting performance at 1080p by 11%. Still, that wasn't enough to catch the 7800X3D, which still ended up being 14% faster than the i9 with 177 FPS on average, and similar margins were again produced at 1440p. And these results were of course gathered using the highest quality preset, which does enable ray tracing. The A Plague Tale Requiem results are also a bit unexpected. Again, we find a situation where the 1300K is not able to improve upon the performance seen with the 13700K, yet the 7800X 3D still manages to be 16% faster at 1080p. Even at 1440p, the 7800X 3D was still 11% faster, as the data appears quite heavily CPU limited, though by the time we hit the 4K resolution, the data is of course 100% GPU limited, as you'd expect. The Ryzen processor is also dominant in Watch Dogs Legion, delivering 24% more performance than the 13900K at 1080p. This is also yet another example where the Core i9 can't really improve upon the i7, despite comfortably losing to the 7800X 3D. The Riftbreaker has always been a strong title for Intel, and the 13900K versus 7800X 3D battle is no exception. The i9 was able to match the 7800X 3D at 1080p, and in fact actually delivered better 1% lows, boosting performance here by 10%. Then last up we have Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2, and this is a fairly even battle between the Core i9 and Ryzen 7 processors with basically identical performance seen at all three tested resolutions, so let's just wrap this one up. Okay, so we've now taken a good look at how the Ryzen 7 7800X 3D and Core i9 13900 compare across a wide range of games. Now it's time to break all of that data down in a single graph to get a clear picture of how these CPUs compare. So at 1080p, the results are pretty much as expected. The 7800X 3D was just 5% faster on average, meaning that overall gaming performance is very similar between these two flagship processors. There are a few examples where the 3D V-cache part was far superior, with no examples where it lost by a significant margin. So AMD certainly does have that going in their favour for gaming, but truth be told, both are exceptionally fast overall. Then as you'd expect, the margin is reduced to just 4% in favour of the 7800X 3D when testing at 1440p, and now there are no examples where the Ryzen 7 processor was slower by more than 2%. There were, however, examples where it was faster by 10% or more, with big wins still coming the way of Watch Dogs Legion and ACC. Then finally, at the 4K resolution, performance is basically identical, as for the most part we're just looking at RTX 4090 performance here, and not really CPU performance. ACC is really the only exception, as that game is heavily CPU limited, and these results, in my opinion, they're not terribly useful, probably not useful at all when looking at CPU performance. You certainly can't work out which CPU actually offers the best value or best gaming performance based on this data, but for whatever reason, some people demand 4K CPU testing, so we try to include it when possible. Okay, so let's talk about power consumption, and firstly, I'll talk about how we measure power consumption, as this caused a bit of confusion in the last video. I use an expensive power meter, which measures power draw from the wall, and it also supports data logging, so I can measure and log real-time total system usage throughout my testing. And for testing, I let the system warm up for 20 minutes, and then run the benchmark pass 3 times, taking the average power usage for each run, which then gives me 3 data points. I then take the average of that data and report it as the final results seen here in this graph. So this is total system usage. It's not peak power usage, but it's almost always very close to peak, within 10 to 20 watts I'd say, as power usage doesn't tend to fluctuate that much in this testing. Obviously, like all of the testing in this video, it's based on stock configurations, so just XMP or Expo loaded, and we're not undervolting here, as that would be very misleading, given results there would vary wildly depending on silicon quality. I should also note that both the AMD and Intel test systems use the same power supply, with the only differences in hardware here being of course the CPU, motherboard, and memory. The only other variable is the frame rate. The higher the frame rate, the harder the GPU needs to work, and therefore the more power the RTX 4090 will be using. But in almost all of these examples, the frame rates were much the same, so for the most part, that factor is a non-issue. The end result, however, being typically much higher power usage for the Core i9-13900K when compared to the 7800X 3D. In fact, the Intel system used an insane 106 watts more on average when compared to the AMD system. Now, we did see some examples, such as Star Wars Jedi Survivor, Resident Evil 4, and A Plague Tale Requiem, where the 13900K used up to 72 watts more power. So well under the average in those examples, but still the 7800X 3D was 14% faster or more at 1080p in those games. Then we see a really insane result, a very high power figure for the 13900K in The Last of Us Part 1, a figure that almost seems impossible, but after further investigation it does start to make sense. For whatever reason, the game heavily utilizes this CPU, 60% for the 13900K, and I did see at least half of the E-cores heavily loaded, and this is what caused the power levels to go through the roof, heavy usage of those E-cores. I was still seeing 70% utilization on the 7800X3D, but with significantly fewer cores, that's really to be expected. Still, even if we ignore the Last of Us result, the 13900K consumed on average 92 watts more than the 7800X3D, and that is a massive, absolutely massive difference for the CPU to make. So if you care about power efficiency, the 13900K will not be the CPU for you, or at the very least you'll have to invest quite a bit of time in tweaking its operating parameters, though of course you could do the same for the 7800X3D. So there you have it, that's how these two processors compare head to head in terms of gaming performance and power consumption. Truth be told, they're both very similar, and this is what I said in my day one 7800X3D review. They do tend to trade blows, resulting in very similar performance overall, though we did find there were more examples where the Ryzen processor won by a significant margin. It does appear as though the 7800X3 is generally faster when paired with DDR5 6000 CL30 memory versus the 13900K using DDR5 7200. This also means that the Ryzen processor is presenting as the best value high-end gaming option right now at $450 US, versus $580 US for the 13900K, making the i9 almost 30% more expensive. So purely for those of you interested in high-end gaming performance, the 7800X3D is clearly a much better value option right now, and it also consumes significantly less power. Beyond gaming though, the 13900K does pack a significantly greater punch with its 16 E-cores, so it does do a better job of giving you sort of the best of both worlds there, I guess. That said though, the 7950X3D can be had for $680 right now, and those 16 big cores ensure strong performance in all productivity workloads, whereas the E-cores, they can be a bit more hit and miss, so you really want to research how the two compare for your particular workloads. Gaming though is a lot more clear cut, and it's generally an 8-core versus 8-core battle between the 7800X3D and 13900K, and it looks like AMD has won this round. That said, Intel is set to strike back shortly with their Raptor Lake refresh, though the upcoming 14th gen series is likely going to be a very minor improvement over the 13th gen, given that it is a refresh. And the biggest gains are likely going to be seen in the way of Cinebench and other applications that use the extra E-cores. Of course, we are yet to test parts like the Core i9-13900K, so it's a bit of an unknown at this point if Intel can catch and even beat AMD for gaming, but we should know in around 3 months' time. Until then, I hope you did find this video useful. If you did, you know what to do. Also subscribe for more content. As I said, more CPU comparisons coming up later this year. And you can also join us over at Floatplane or Patreon if you'd like to get access to some pretty cool stuff. We have an exclusive Discord server for members only. We do monthly live streams, behind the scenes content, and Q&A stuff. So check that out if you're interested, but if not, that is perfectly fine. And I would like to thank you for watching this video. I'm your host, Steve. See you again next time.